Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez. I'm a professor in the English department here at LaGuardia Community College. I'm joined today by Viviana and Elias, who are this year's editors for The Lit, and our guest speaker, Ricardo Alberto Maldonado. The Lit is LaGuardia's literary and arts magazine. We publish an issue once a year. We're excited to be interviewing, once again, Ricardo Alberto Maldonado and to discuss his latest poetry collection, The Life Assignment.
Hi everyone, I'm Viviana. Ricardo Alberto Maldonado was born and raised in Puerto Rico. He is the co-editor of Puerto Rico en mi corazon and the recipient of fellowships from Cantomundo, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and Queer Art Mentorship. He lives in New York, where he serves as managing editor at the 92nd Street Y.
So welcome, Ricky. I have the first question for you. And could you tell us a little bit about how you started writing poetry?
So I started writing poems, right? So this is a question that we get often, and there's always a public answer and the private answer. Because I admire what you are all doing at LaGuardia, I'm going to give you the private one. I don't come from a family where I was made to read when I was young, by which I mean I went to school, I read in both languages, I read the newspaper every morning, for example. And I read whatever was assigned in school, but I don't remember reading for pleasure. There were books everywhere, but the newspaper was my major source of literature. And so it was not until my father died when I was in high school. I believe I was 18, but maybe 17 or 16. He was sick for a whole year, maybe a little bit more. Yeah, Agent Orange, a cancer induced by Agent Orange exposure when he volunteered to serve the state in Vietnam. But it was then when I came across a poem that he had seen in a book he was reading while he was in treatment. I don't really remember the author or the name. And of course, I had been reading poetry in school, so I knew poetry and I was very good at analyzing, right? And reading it and talking about it. But it was then that sort of literature changed, like it transformed, and I think it had to do with the fact that maybe, and this is me thinking now back at it, what I had been reading was not providing the answers for the questions that I had. And I think that poem sort of reflected something about that doubt or about that questioning. The first poem I remember truly loving, because it struck me, was a poem I don't no longer necessarily love, but it was so important to me. It was A. Houseman's To an Athlete Dying Young, and for obvious reasons, right? It is a meditation on the death of a young athlete, and also a meditation on what it means to remember. And I remember thinking, okay, well, I don't know what being a poet is like. I don't know any of this other than once in a while I found myself writing. And then when I went to college, I remember thinking, I want to be a doctor because I want to be there. I want to be there for my family or for families like mine. But I also wanted to study English literature or literature in English because I love reading and I wanted to do both. And by some magical happenstance, my advisor was a poet. I was assigned a poet as an advisor. And she said, take my class. I ended up not finishing that school, by which I mean pre-med. I did all the requirements, but I never took the MCATs, and I'm very proud of that. And just writing, just falling in love with this vision of myself as a writer and as a reader. And since I was in college, I was writing, probably a poem a day. When I was younger, now it's a poem a week, if I'm lucky. But so that's my trajectory, right? I went to grad school to complete an MFA in creative writing and poetry. And since then, that has been a very rewarding part of my life.
Thank you, Ricky, for that answer. Many of our viewers are LaGuardia students. So as a follow-up question, what was your inspiration for writing the life assignment? And how does that book come to life? As in, how did you put the book together? Or how does a book like this happen?
The book happened because it got to the point where that's what needed to take place, right? I wrote so many poems, and this current version is not the version I had finished while I was at Columbia. I believe I only kept 1 or 2 poems I wrote in grad school, and I graduated from grad school in 2007, I believe. So this book is, when you think about it, more than a decade old. In the process of writing poems, right, you spend days, months, years thinking and writing and absorbing art. I write with works of art surrounding me, whether that means I have, for example, copies of Ocean Vuong's book, or I'm watching Netflix. You know, I'm always consuming art, always thinking about poetry, because it means the world to me to see myself as a reader of poetry and as a writer of poetry, because I think it makes me more inquisitive, more sensitive, and gives me the ability to challenge the state, the laws of the country, because I'm from Puerto Rico and those laws are pretty awful. And this is not something that's particular to Puerto Ricans, right? But I'm speaking from my life and my experience. And so I wrote what I thought was a great version of the manuscript, and no one was taking it. And it had another title. It was from the Wild and Perpendicular Earth. That was the first working title, which was a line from the book, which is not in this book, I believe. That poem is no longer there. And no one was taking it, so I kept writing. And the more I wrote, the more I grew confident with the way I was speaking about the world. And so I started replacing everything. And then Maria happened. And I obviously didn't need Maria to engage with my country, with Puerto Rico in a deep sense. I didn't need Maria. There was no silver lining to Maria at all. I don't mean to suggest that, but Maria really challenged how I saw myself in the mainland, how I saw my family, what I perceived was a responsibility to speak with them or speak to them. I was thinking of my nephews. And so soon after that, I started writing poems in Spanish. I wrote in English, and so I started writing in Spanish. And that's not to say that my work in Spanish is more accessible, but my hope was that my nephews could one day pick this up and like understand something at a deep guttural level, because it's in their home language, right? And of course they speak both languages at home, but but I wanted to really appeal to that inner part that exists below the chest. I believe Federico Garcia Lorca calls it Cantomundo, like deep song. And that's what I wanted to do. And it came right after Maria, and it was, or if I'm honest to myself, it actually came after the shooting at Pulse, where many of those who were murdered were Puerto Ricans who had fled the island due to years of economic austerity. That's an event that really, I don't even know how to describe it. It's unfair to say I was at a loss of words. I was devastated. Like I was a wreck. I couldn't stop weeping for members of my community I didn't know, right? Because I am a gay Puerto Rican. And then, so I kept writing, and I kept writing poems in Spanish, and everything felt right to me, writing these poems in Spanish. And then sort of like thinking I had the power to mistranslate or change them when I wrote them in English. When you look at my book, some of the poems are lazily translated. Why? Because I felt like I had the right to privilege something, to privilege a part of me. And that's why, for example, some of the poems in the book, those that come in both languages, the English is in a different shade, right? So the English usually comes, interesting, in the first edition of this manuscript, or the first printing, the English was in a shade of gray, and the Spanish was in a shade of black. because I wanted to privilege the Spanish visually, at least. That's something that has been lost in the translation of the book into other subsequent editions, but that's something that was very important to me, as well as like making sure that I was writing in Spanish, speaking as someone from a community to my community, and that not only includes Spanish speakers, right? So I give you a very long answer because it is a lived life. The title, God, I had so many titles, from Goodbye Octopus to Cesar Vallejo is Dead. He was a great Peruvian writer in the early 1900s, and there's this beautiful poem where a line is Cesar Vallejo ha muerto, and I wanted that as a title for a while. Then when I had the final version of the manuscript, I saw this line in my manuscript and I said, oh my God, that's the title. It's in a poem. And I'm like, this is the title. And since that, I just keep thinking about the life assignment as many things that exist in my life. So the things that have been given to me, the things I need to learn, the things I'm responsible for, the things I want to communicate, why I write. I like, one of my favorite books when I was learning to write was Elizabeth Bishop's Geography 3, which is formatted like a textbook. And so I wanted my book to have something of that in it. Asignaciones. And in fact, when I have time and I'm signing books, I haven't done that a lot because of the pandemic, but I tend to include a writing assignment or some kind of assignment for the reader to take home. Usually the assignment is something like encuentra tus respuestas o encuentra tus preguntas, like find your answers, find your questions, define your questions, etc.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. This next question touches on something you've already mentioned, because the life assignment has some bilingual poems, but could you talk a little bit about what the process is like and how do you balance writing in English and Spanish?
Great question. So all of what I've said, keeping that in mind, it still remains somewhat of a mysterious process, by which I mean, so when I write, I think that the poem is, I sit down to write and there's a blank page and I start usually with borrowed language or something I heard or misheard, and I put it on the page, and then, but I usually put it on the page in Spanish because it automatically syncs to me in Spanish. And if not, I can play with the words, play with the orders. I tend to put adjectives or adverbs in the wrong places, or switch verb tenses because I want my lines to sing differently. I like poems that have a lot of texture, right? You can't touch a poem, but I like to think that when I read my poems to myself, I am touching something. I'm using more than one sense, more than the visual or oral, right? If I'm reading it out loud. And so that starts generating a poem, and you look at it and you go like, well, this is good, but this is not really what I want to write about. And then I discover a subject within the poem. So, right, so there's what you start with, and then there's the discovered subject, right? And sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're drastically different. For example, in one of my recent poems, which I hope to read for all of you, I wrote about being called a spick in Brooklyn. And then I realized that I wanted that the poem had to include that, but it was really a poem about being in the mainland and the real lonesomeness of being a Puerto Rican in the mainland. It's a kind of it feels like an easy, great, because I have citizenship, so my travels are easier, but it feels like an easy form of exile, but an exile nonetheless. And so the poem wanted to cover things like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, right, that lonesomeness, but also the fact that Puerto Rico is facing real crippling austerity measures imposed by the Congress of the United States. And so when I sat down to write, I didn't know that. But like I was writing in Spanish and that kept coming back. That kept like yelling at me. And so I was writing it in Spanish and like really finding the connection, pushing the connections, doing things here and there. And then once the poem was done, I said, well, you know, I want my friends who speak English to read this and understand how lonely this feels, or how angry I am at times, or how awful it is to be called something else, or and by which I mean, you know, when someone mispronounces your name or calls you Ricardo or Richard, and you're like, well, you know, that's micro, right? I don't get angry by that anymore, but it happens so often. And I go like, that's not my name. I mean, thank you for the address, but that's not my name, right? Honor that part of me that I have chosen to share with you. And so even if it's just a name. And so I started playing with the poem, trying to be as clear as I could while maintaining a sense of like mystery, which I love poems because poems really have room for mystery. Like a good poem will make you ask questions as a writer, right? As a reader too, but as a writer, I feel like my poems leave me utterly mystified at times, because what in life isn't mystifying? We're in the middle of a late stage pandemic, right? And nothing about this makes sense to me. Nothing about the way that I move around in the world right now makes sense to me. And it has been, what, 3 years now, 2.5 years? It's requiring us to live with a lot of like access to things that we cannot define. And so I think a poem does that. I hope. But Elias, to go back to your question, so as a summary, it's really the interaction between Spanish and English is basic, or at a basic level is meant to reveal those connections, exploit differences, while keeping in mind that the poem comes in Spanish first. And that's something that's very important to me. At this stage in my life, who knows what's going to happen in the next 5 years? Maybe I just stop translating into English or mistranslating into English and leave it to someone else, right?
Thank you, Ricky. Our final question, what advice can you give to many of the aspiring writers watching this video?
That's such a great question, because I ask that question myself all the time. What advice do I have for myself? Because as a writer, you're constantly evolving, and it is your responsibility to read. Always read. You are, even if you're writing against the canon, you are always writing parallel to it. And if you are someone who's not white, male, from the mainland, but are living in the mainland, you need to find your mentors, especially if they're not being taught in school. You know, I read Puerto Rican and Latin American writers in high school often. I know them very well, but I got to grad school and in college, I never read anything by someone who spoke Spanish or was translated from the Spanish, or a member of the diaspora who wrote in English. That was never a part of the curriculum, and that was devastating in ways I cannot describe. In the same way that when you think of some of the great queer writers of the 80s, they died because of AIDS. And so like we have lost so many. And so when my advice is find that writing, find your community, find your mentors, write with them. I write with books around me, where if I watch television, I take mental notes and I write stuff down, because the world is full of literature that is necessary to be, it is absolutely necessary to engage with it and to question it, especially if it's language that comes from the state. If it's a law, if it's a Supreme Court or a draft of a Supreme Court decision, that needs to be engaged with, that needs to be challenged, because these are things that have real effect on people's lives. And I feel like literature can do that. That's not to say, right, all literature is political by nature. And that's not to say that your writing has to be overtly political or of an activist vein, but as a writer, you have to engage with the way in which people live, and you have to do it ethically. And that sounds a lot, but right, but like, think of writing as a profession. You know, doctors train for years before they can touch a human body. Lawyers before, you know, also train. Writers also have to do the same. Oh God, and have fun. Write the thing that scares you the most.
That's awesome. I like how at the end you're like, oh yeah, have fun. I forgot.
Have fun. I mean, there's nothing like sitting down, blank page. You all of a sudden find that you've written, I don't know, let's say 3 paragraphs, and you go like, oh my God, I can cut this, I can move this. It's really lovely. Lovely. It's torturous, but it's also really fun. I find myself when I write.
That's great. Ricky, this conversation has been so enriching for all of us, and I'm sure for those who are going to be watching this video. So thanks again. Thanks, Elias. Thanks, Viviana, for all of the questions. We now want to shift to have you read some of your poems for us. So go ahead and take it away.
I'm just going to read 2 short poems that suddenly come to me as representative. The first one is the poem I wrote immediately after Maria. And this one I'm going to read in English and in Spanish. I give you my heart, os doy mi corazón. I find myself on my feet with 15 leaves. Everything carries its own light on the walls. I woke up to slaughter, my heart opening to cemeteries of moon, the parasites, the drizzle, the mud crowning the undergrowth within men's sadness. I knew death when I dressed in my uniform. I found the index of my solitude, my country, and its legal jargon, its piety, its fiction. Yes, it loves me, really. I give my blood as the blood of old fish. Me encuentro de pie con 15 hojas. Brilla todos los muros. Desperté en su sacrificio. Mi corazón se abría entre cementerios de luna, los parásitos, la llovizna, el lodo coronando la maleza con mustios grandes. Supe de mi muerte al vestir de uniforme. Encontré el índice de soledad, mi país en su jerga legal, su piedad, su ficción, sí me quiere de verdad. Doy mi sangre como la sangre de todos los peces. And then perhaps this, because I've been thinking about my family in Puerto Rico, and I was texting with them today, so I almost missed this meeting thanks to that. But I'm going to read this poem, if I can find it. Oh my God. This poem I wrote thinking of them, and also thinking about the need to complicate language as a way to speak of my love for them. The title is lesionado, which means injured in Spanish, and it's gonna come in the 2 languages as well. Lesionado. Maybe this will be a poem about power, rereading whatever shape the intelligence takes. Somewhere, somehow, the men the state somewhere seems to destroy. Only we should be beautiful and practical. Finding beauty will stand everywhere among 2 Victorias, my brothers and I among them. Home for its noun, home for its soil. 1, 2, 3, 4, I among them. Maybe this is a poem about power. Maybe this is a poem about love. Tal vez este sea un poema sobre el poder, leyendo, releyendo cualquier forma que la inteligencia pudiese tomar. De algún modo, donde van hombres, el Estado de algún modo les parece destruir. Solo debemos ser hermosos y prácticos, encontrando que durará la belleza en todas partes. Entre 2 victorias, mis hermanos y yo, ese hogar como su sustantivo, ese hogar en su barro, 1, 2, 3, 4, y yo entre ellos. Tal vez este sea un poema sobre el poder. Tal vez este sea un poema sobre el amor. Thank you for listening.
Wow. Well, thank you again, Ricky, Viviana, and Sonia. This has been a wonderful conversation. Everyone, please make sure to purchase Ricky's book. The links will be in the description box. Bye-bye, everyone.